Some years ago I've bought my first camera, a Canon 200D. For that time it was a pretty decent camera, considering that the pictures were not that bad actually, and the video function were okay for that time. When I bought it I was more focused on photography than videos, and that camera had a really big problem: the sensor. The sensor's performances in low light situations were terrible, especially if we consider that I was used to shoot with the 80 to 50 mm, 18 to 55 mm f5.6 I think from Canon, which was the kit lens, and that was actually a terrible lens. Everyone who started his journey in photography or in filmmaking in the last decade has probably come across at some point a 50mm f1.8. Probably the most famous one was the one from Canon. The 50mm f1.8 from Canon is probably a must-have for all the Canon shooters out there, especially for those who started with a reflex. Even if you shoot with other brands, probably the most popular cheap lens you can buy, it's a 50mm f1.8. I have used this lens as a beginner for a very long time for a lot of projects, and nowadays I still use it sometimes from some professional projects as a professional filmmaker and photographer. All the popularity of this object comes from the fact that it is a very bright lens, f1.8 is a very good aperture, and from the fact that it is very cheap. I think when I bought it new, I spent more or less 100 euros.
Small update, as of today you can find this lens new for almost 150 euros and no longer for just 100 euros.
For it, which is really a really low price for a good camera lens. So, is a 50mm f1.8 the best lens to start with? We will discover it in this video. Before we begin, let me introduce myself. My name is Stefano Weber. I am a professional content creator, filmmaker and photographer from Italy, based in the Italian Alps. If you don't want to miss any other content that I will be uploading on this platform, I suggest you to subscribe to my channel and activate the little bell. As I've said before, I am Italian, so I am not a native English speaker. So I apologize in advance if in speaking I will make some minor grammatically or pronunciation errors. Please let me know in the comment section below if something that I will say is not clear, so that I can explain it to you. So, 50mm f1.8, probably the most popular lens between beginner photographers and beginner filmmakers. But is it really the best lens to start with? 50mm is a very strange focal length. It is not as wide as a 35mm, for example, and it is not as compressed as a 85mm. Some people like this focal length, some people don't. Personally, I am not a big fan of the 50mm focal length, because I personally kinda don't feel any kind of personality from this focal length. It is not, as I've said before, it is not wide, it is not compressed, it is mid. This is subjective, I know. I also know a lot of professional photographers and filmmakers that love to use this kind of lenses on their cameras. It will be a good idea to specify the type of sensor we are mounting this lens, because on APS-C cameras this focal length will have a different usability than in full-frame cameras. The compression remains the same, but it feels a little bit different. And personally, I actually don't dislike the effect that 50mm has on APS-C cameras. The problem with a 50mm compression is that it's not that different than a 35mm compression, which is the focal length that I use more. So, when I have to alternate a wide-looking frame, for example made with a 35mm with a compressed one, I am not a big fan of 50mm lens. Simply because the 50mm focal length compression is very similar to the 35mm compressions. And I know that a lot of you will probably like this kind of couple of focal lengths to alternate 35 and 50mm, and that's okay. For the compressed looking frames, I really prefer to use 70 or 85mm lenses. It differs much more and gives more compression to the image. But what about the everyday usage of this kind of lenses? I personally think that this focal length it's not very versatile, at least not versatile as a 35mm or as a 24mm, for example. In conclusion, personally I don't like this focal length. It is not wide, it is not close, is neither fish nor fowl. Speaking about the aperture, f1.8 is a very good aperture. It allows you to shoot in low light situations, maintaining a certain quality on your clips. If you are starting now, you are not probably going to spend thousands and thousands of euros on your gear, and I don't suggest you to do it. So the sensor you are start shooting with will not be the best, especially in low light situations. And the f1.8 aperture can really help you to deal with bad lights. And having this opportunity for just 100 euros or less if you go to the second-hand market, believe me, is a very good deal. This kind of aperture allows you to have that kind of blurry and soft background, which is great on portraits and for details. f1.8 is not the biggest aperture you can find in the market. You can find also f1.4 or 1.2 lenses, and those ones are extremely expensive, especially if we consider that we are talking about prime lenses. It depends on your style, but in my opinion, if you're starting now, f1.8 is more than enough. Not just for the price, which is definitely a point, but even for the fact that if you are going to start now your journey in filmmaking or photography, you will probably not be able to take all the advantages that expensive gear will offer to you. As you can probably imagine, this lens is not a tank. It is a cheap product. You can't expect a very durable lens for this price. Even the autofocus is a little bit noisy. Speaking about the autofocus, is not the best autofocus out there, but it is actually okay. I have never had any particular problem with the autofocus of this lens, and just to let you know, the RF version of this product, the newest Canon 50mm f1.8, does a slightly better job on these aspects. Considering that most of you will start shooting with an APS-C camera and some of you will continue shooting with an APS-C camera or with a Super 35 sensor camera, 50mm is not a versatile lens. Leaving aside the fact that I personally dislike this focal length, I don't really like to use 50mm in general. If you're shooting on APS-C, a 50mm will become, I think, 80mm and 85mm, which is good in certain cases, but which is not versatile at all. When I've started my journey in photography and later in filmmaking, I had just two lenses, the 18 to 55mm, which was a terrible lens, and the 50mm f1.8. I've used mostly the 50mm f1.8, and all the pictures and clips that I've made in that period look more or less the same, because I've used just one focal length, which is not the best choice actually. Even if in details and portraits this focal length is a very excellent choice. In those cases I think this is probably the best focal length you can mount on APS-C cameras. In all the other contexts, there are better lenses, like for example a 24mm or a 35mm. In conclusion, despite its price, I still think that this is a very good lens. Actually, the image quality is great. I still use it for some professional projects, and the results are very good. However, if you are starting now and if you have the possibility to do it, I strongly suggest you to don't start with a 50mm lens, but to try a 35mm lens, because it is wider and it is still good for close-up frames like portraits or details, but it is also good when you have to shoot wider frames. It's just more versatile than a 50mm, in my honest opinion. Anyway, the 50mm f1.8 has become a classic, and for some reasons. Please let me know in the comment what do you think about these kind of lenses, if you have one or if you have tried one. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If so, I ask you to click the like button and to subscribe to my channel and activate the little bell. See you in the next video.